What if Christianity had never emerged as a major religion? Christendom, 600 CE. Western Europe around the year 600 in the Common Era, or Anno Domini, was not a fantastic place and time to live. Despite efforts by some historians in recent times to argue that this era shouldn't be referred to as the Dark Ages, there is substantial reason for referring to it as such. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed in the 5th century CE. Living standards had declined dramatically in tandem in places like Italy, Spain, France, and England. Roman roads and aqueducts were falling into disrepair. Lawlessness prevailed in many places. The cities and towns were being abandoned as people could no longer rely on the trade networks that had once supplied them with food and goods from faraway places, and instead had to head back to the countryside to eke out a subsistence living themselves off the land. The culture of the continent had entered a period of steep regression, and there was the constant fear of new invasions as groups like the Slavs, Bulgars, and Lombards continued to arrive to the Mediterranean world to carve out their own principalities. It was not a great time. But if there was one shining light in all of this, it was that the Roman Catholic Church was offering some sort of leadership in the region following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Saint Benedict of Nursia had lived and worked earlier in the 6th century to establish a new range of monastic settlements in Italy, and the Benedictines were fast becoming one of the major religious movements of Western Christendom, playing roles not just in religion but politics, economic activity, and poor relief in many regions. Pope Gregory the Great, Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604, had strengthened the Church of Rome and sent out missions to begin converting many of the pagan groups who had conquered parts of the Roman Empire. Much further to the north, on the periphery of what had been the Roman Empire, Christian scholars like Bede the Venerable would soon be working on revitalizing Christian culture in Anglo-Saxon Britain, while Gaelic monks led by St. Columba operating out of Ireland and Scotland were beginning to play a great role in the Christian missionary movement. Such was the role the Church would begin to play in European life that, for better and worse, the former lands of the Western Roman Empire would become known as Christendom, the dominion of Christ. Over time, the Church replaced the Western Roman Empire as the power which lent some sense of unity to Western and Central Europe in the Dark Ages. This raises a big question. What would have happened in Europe during this time if Christianity had never emerged in the final centuries of the Roman Empire? What would medieval Europe have looked like after the Roman Empire had collapsed if Christianity were taken completely out of the equation? The improbable rise of the Roman Catholic Church. Before exploring the alternatives, let's just briefly recap on what did happen. How did the Roman Catholic Church emerge for figures like Saint Benedict, Pope Gregory, Saint Columba, and Bede the Venerable to shape it so profoundly in the first place? It's a complex story. The Christians, or followers of Christ, started as one of several radical Jewish religious groups in Roman Judea in the middle of the 1st century CE. This was a land experiencing huge religious and political fluctuations, as the Jewish people were one of the few groups that the Romans ruled over that they had never managed to fully pacify. There were many other radical Jewish groups beyond the Christians, notably the Zealots, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Pharisees. Where the Christians diverged from all of these was that they quickly decided to set themselves apart from the Jewish people by becoming willing to try and convert Gentiles, non-Jewish people, to their cause. Indeed, after the Jewish revolt of 66 CE and the development of anti-Jewish policies such as the fiscus judaicus, or Roman tax, by the Roman state, the Christians began consciously identifying themselves as being distinct from the Jewish people. They portrayed themselves as adherents of a new and distinct religion, began writing their own religious texts, and also headed off on missionary trips to places like Greece, Anatolia, and to Rome itself to convert communities of Gentiles to Christianity. It was a slow process. As late as around 110 CE, the Roman governor of the province of Bithynia and Pontus in what is now Western Turkey, Pliny the Younger, could write to the Emperor Trajan querying how he was to deal with a group of Christians in his province. He wrote about them like they were something of a novelty that few people had come into contact with before. They were certainly not a major movement yet, 3/4 of a century after Christ's own time. What changed matters for the Christians were developments in the 3rd century CE. The Roman Empire went through a period of profound crisis at this time. Waves of Germanic and Asiatic tribes like the Franks, Alemanni, Sarmatians, and Goths were attacking the northern borders along the Rhine and Danube rivers, and in some instances infiltrating and occupying large parts of the Roman provinces in Gaul and elsewhere along the frontier for years at a time. The economy of the empire was in dire straits as inflation, a concept which was not really understood at the time, became rampant owing to devaluation of the Roman coinage in order to pay for ever larger armies. Those armies were needed not just to pay for the defense of the northern frontier, but to engage in civil war. Between the end of the Severan dynasty in 235 CE and the accession of the Emperor Diocletian in 284 CE, a period of half a century, Rome had dozens of emperors. Some lasted little more than a few months before being replaced by some other general who had emerged as a claimant to the throne. At times the empire was essentially divided up between 3 or 4 men who claimed to be emperor, while far to the east the Palmyran queen Zenobia invaded and occupied Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia for several years in the early 270 CE. In this socio-political climate, the nascent Christian church ballooned in popularity. There were probably no more than 250,000 Christians throughout the Roman Empire in 200 CE out of a total population of maybe 50 million or so people. But by 300 CE, there were millions of Christians. More and more people joined the church every year. Christianity, with its message of salvation in the afterlife and the sanctity of the poor and oppressed, had captured the zeitgeist of a world in turmoil where all the old truths of Roman life and stability had been called into question. Hence it was that in 313 CE, the Emperor Constantine the Great issued the Edict of Milan, calling for tolerance of the Christians after decades of attempts by Roman emperors to suppress the religion and persecute the Christians. Over time, he established a formal church, and Christianity was soon adopted as a formal state religion within the Roman Empire. It had become immensely powerful by the 5th century CE, even as the Roman Empire itself was collapsing, particularly the Western Roman Empire. Thus, when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE by a Germanic warlord in Italy, the Roman Catholic Church, headed by the Bishop of Rome or Pope, stepped into the breach as the institution which provided continuity between the age of the Roman Empire and medieval Europe that followed it. Before long, the Pope was the power who was mediating between the new Germanic kings who had replaced the Roman provincial governors as the powers that controlled places like Gaul, Hispania, and Italia. What on earth would have happened if there had been no church? Most importantly, what religion would have prevailed in Europe in the absence of the church? Alternative number 1, paganism. There are numerous alternative scenarios that might have prevailed had the Christian Church never emerged from obscurity in the 3rd century CE. In terms of the religion of the former lands of the empire, things could plausibly have gone on much as they had been. The traditional polytheistic religions of the Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, and others, what Christians soon came to term the pagans, and which were all quite similar to one another, could have remained dominant across the former lands of the Western Roman Empire. Indeed, this is less difficult to imagine than it might appear. Christianity in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as it was adopted as the state religion of Rome, incorporated a huge amount of elements of the pagan religions into its belief system. For instance, some of the Christian religious festivals were deliberately established on dates where they mimicked pagan festivals, the idea being that it would not be too jarring for a Roman to convert to the new faith. It is no coincidence, for instance, that the date of Christ's Mass, the alleged anniversary of his birth, was fixed as being on the 25th of December. This came just a week after the Saturnalia, a Roman pagan festival which was one of the most important religious dates in the Roman calendar. Gifts were exchanged on the Saturnalia, and it constituted a high point of festivities in the middle of the winter. Similarly, the Christian cult of the saints, whereby dozens of martyred Christians were established as saints and people that a person would pray to over certain matters, was deliberately designed by the early organizers of the Christian Church to reflect the system of local saints and cults that prevailed in the pagan faiths. Hence, the early Christian Church was more pagan than meets the eye. Therefore, had Christianity never flourished and paganism had remained the dominant religion in the Mediterranean, things would have remained the same for many medieval worshippers, with their belief in magic and saints and a calendar dictated by quasi-pagan festivals. What would have really been different if paganism had survived would have been the lack of centralized political authority after the Western Roman Empire collapsed. By the 7th and 8th centuries CE, the popes in Rome were the closest equivalent that Western Europe had to the Roman emperors of old. If there was no Roman Catholic Church, there would have been no central figure exercising authority over life in England, Spain, France, Italy, and parts of Germany. Paganism was not a centralized religion in this way. Individual temples had high priests, and within a city or town there was a religious hierarchy. But no temple in southern England, for instance, was going to take orders from a high priest in Rome or Paris. It didn't work this way, and without Christianity, a pagan medieval Europe would have lacked the political unity and identity that Christianity and the Church lent to it during the Middle Ages. Moreover, all art and culture that was produced in Europe between the year 500 and 1500 was, broadly speaking, religious art. Whether it was the illuminated manuscripts of the monasteries in the early Middle Ages, the Romanesque and Gothic architecture of the churches and cathedrals of the High Middle Ages, or the late medieval and Renaissance literature of the 14th and 15th centuries, all of it focused to some extent on Christianity or was patronized by the Church. Given all of this, it's hard to escape the idea that Europe would have been a very, very different place, politically, socially, and culturally in the millennium after the fall of the Roman Empire, had it not been for the rise of Christianity. The possible outcomes are limitless. Perhaps a more centralized pagan church would have emerged. Alternatively, the pagan religions might have continued much as they had been before, and instead of a religiously orientated medieval society that was at times very stagnant, a more vibrant and secular culture might have emerged in the Mediterranean world in the centuries after Rome fell. It really is anyone's guess. Alternative number 2, Neo-Druidic religions and Neo-Platonism. There is a different set of possibilities, though, ones which are often completely overlooked when we consider the world of late antiquity. Perhaps, for instance, the Druidic religion of the Celtic peoples of Gaul and Western Germania, which still survived in a residual fashion in the western provinces. would have re-emerged in a revitalized form as soon as the Western Roman Empire collapsed. This could have been galvanized by the arrival of the Germanic peoples into these provinces with their worship of similar deities to those the Celts had once worshipped, like Odin and Thor. This might well have been the scenario in the Western provinces if Christianity had never arrived there. Something very different, however, was occurring in the East. The 3rd century CE is notable not just for the rise of Christianity in the Eastern Mediterranean. At the very same time, a new movement was emerging in the same region that was a mix of a religious and philosophical system, with a strong emphasis as well on scientific inquiry. Neo-Platonism was grounded on the teachings of the ancient Athenian philosopher Plato, but it was expanded and taken in different directions by several generations of quasi-religious philosophers like Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus. Working from the old centers of Greek learning in Athens and Alexandria, these figures worked out a very complex system in which they debated how the soul and matter interacted with an entity which they termed the One, a substance or being that prevailed over all of existence. It is hard to define what Neo-Platonism was. It was not strictly speaking a form of monotheistic religion, nor was it exclusively a philosophical school. Instead, it blended theological elements with philosophy and scientific inquiry, all overlaid with mysticism and even a belief in magic, or what the Greeks and Romans of late antiquity called a theurgy. In this sense, it was not a million miles away from being a kind of Mediterranean version of Confucianism. Had Christianity never emerged as a dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean, it is possible that Neo-Platonism might have become a major movement there in the centuries that followed, eventually taking on a similar status to what Confucianism became in China and other places in the Far East of Asia. In such a scenario, Athens and Alexandria might have emerged as the centers of a new Eastern religious system. As it turned out, Neo-Platonism was destroyed by the nascent Christian movement between the late 4th and 6th centuries, as hordes of Christian zealots began attacking centers of Neoplatonic learning in Athens, Alexandria, and other cities of the East. Even so, medieval scholars, particularly in the Arab lands in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, showed a sufficient interest in Neo-Platonism and the religious elements of it that many Neoplatonic texts were preserved in the early Middle Ages and have consequently survived down to the present day by figures like Plotinus. Alternative number 3, a tapestry of religions. The third major possibility is that a tapestry of new religions might have emerged. It isn't a coincidence that both Christianity and Neoplatonism were emerging as major systems at the same time in the 3rd century. Quite simply, Roman society was changing dramatically at this time. Even before the Roman Empire fell, Roman society was becoming something new and very different. So much so that some historians today refer to a Roman Revolution. Such was the scale of intellectual, social, religious, and cultural change. Christianity and Neoplatonism were 2 symptoms of this, but there were many others. The cult of Mithras or Mithraism was another. This centered on the worship of Mithras, an Eastern deity that had arrived to the Eastern provinces in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE from the Parthian Empire and became very popular amongst the Roman legionaries. Mithras was a kind of god of justice and security, something which appealed to the legionaries' sense of themselves as the arbiters of power and justice in the Roman Empire. Mithraism might best be described as a form of monolatry. This is a religious stance where a person worships a core, powerful deity, but does not completely disavow the existence of other gods and goddesses. Mithraism was in part derived from Zoroastrianism, a more strictly monotheistic religion that had emerged in Persia centuries earlier, and which had maintained a core following in the Parthian Empire, Armenia, and amongst some people in the eastern provinces over the centuries. It could have started to gain greater numbers of followers in this peculiar religious environment had Christianity not served as a rival branch of monotheism. There are many other similar examples. There was a strong emerging cult of Helios, the sun god, in the eastern Mediterranean in the 3rd century CE. The emperor Elagabalus, who reigned controversially between 218 CE and 222 CE before being murdered in a palace coup, was a priest of Elagabal, a local variant of Helios in Syria. He toyed with the idea of making worship of the sun deity a form of state religion. Another group that is historically attested to was the Hypsistarians, a schismatic group of monotheists who left inscriptions worshipping Theos Hypsistos in the East in the 4th century CE. Had Christianity not emerged as a dominant state religion in the 4th and 5th centuries, it is possible that a veritable smorgasbord of new and different religions would have emerged instead to take the place of the pagan polytheism that had prevailed around the Mediterranean world for so long. Perhaps different religions would have prevailed in different kingdoms that succeeded the Roman Empire, with Neo-Platonism becoming the dominant philosophical and religious system of the Byzantine Empire, but Mithraism, Zoroastrianism, and the worship of Helios, the sun god, being preferred in various places in North Africa and the Near East. The long-term implications. Whatever religious system might have emerged out of the collapse of the Roman Empire had Christianity not prevailed, the impact and long-term implications would have been immense, not just in the immediate term, but also in terms of the knock-on effects over several centuries. For instance, Islam emerged in the 620 and 630 CE out of the teachings of Muhammad, a figure who viewed himself as a prophet in the line of Jesus Christ. Had it not been for the diffusion of Abrahamic and Judeo-Christian religious ideas into the Arabian desert between the 3rd and early 7th centuries, the Arab conquests that followed from Muhammad's teachings and actions would never have occurred. These changed the world, with an Arab caliphate soon established that stretched from Morocco and Spain in the west to Afghanistan in the east. In the great centers of Arab learning in Baghdad and Cordoba in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, scholars like Averroes and Avicenna made breakthroughs in the spheres of mathematics and scientific inquiry which changed the world. These discoveries would have been made eventually, but had it not been for the infiltration of Christianity into the Arabian desert, the Arab conquests, and the emergence of Islam from it, they certainly would have occurred in very different ways. Centuries later, the age of exploration in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries was, in part, driven by a European sense of their divine mission to convert the heathens of the world. Of course, economic incentives played their part, and Europeans might well have engaged in the rapacious colonial behavior, which they did anyway, even if they hadn't been Christians. But what all of this emphasizes is how different world history would have been, and how many variables there were which would have been altered even 1,000 years later if Christianity had never emerged in the dying centuries of the Roman Empire. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel to show your support and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.